The Problems of a Pastoral Modernity. In her treatise on the relationship between architecture and modernity, Hilde Heynen explores the 20th century's legacy of attempts to come to terms with modernity through construction of residential environments. Describing the profound upheaval that has come with the transition to a modern way of life, Heynen contrasts, on the one hand, the effort to naturalize these transformations, turning them into a story of smooth experience and untroubled progress, with, on the other hand, the attempt to emphasize and embrace the shocking disruption that modern technology and culture represent. Heynen chronicles the search for resolution of the contradictions of modernity, privileging, in her analysis, modes of resolution that do not force reconciliation on the paradoxes, disjunctures, and unassimilated difference that she sees as intrinsic to modern experience. In this way, Heynen addresses the difficulties and contradictions of a technological world that both inspires escape and also makes this escape possible. Taking her epigraph from critical theorist Theodor Adorno, Heynen emphasizes the necessity of living with contradiction, but also recognizes the urge toward the sort of escapist reconciliation that the traditional pastoral seeks to make between artifice and nature. Quote, "Beauty today can have no other measure except the depth to which a work resolves contradictions. A work must cut through the contradictions and overcome them, not by covering them up, but by pursuing them." End quote. For Heynen, a relationship with modernity requires elements of both reconciliation and disruption. A degree of reconciliation makes it easier to inhabit the discontinuity and paradox of modern enterprise and everyday life, but Heynen cautions vigorously against succumbing too much to one side or the other, to a facile tale of uncontested progress, or facile rejection of modernity, on one hand, or a revolutionary vision of constant flux on the other. Heynen describes forced reconciliation as the pastoral vision of modernity, a vision that has opted for illusory closure by covering up contradiction. And she describes abandonment of any possibility of reconciliation, intentional plunges into chaos, as counter-pastoral. Futurists and radical modernists, with their embrace of speed and the sleekness of the machine age, stripped of all the clutter of human scale and attachment, might be counted as counter-pastoral, the exurban attempt to blend a lifestyle fully serviced by the consumer economy of capitalist modernity with the untouched pristineness of an imagined enchanted forest, might be called pastoral. Through her stretch of the word pastoral to cover even the impulse toward this sort of wishful smoothing out of the undesirable but necessary details of everyday life, Heynen's concept helps sort through the representations of desirability and undesirability in the confusing and often postmodern landscapes of Exurbia to clarify what is being sought and what is being escaped, or from what affliction solace is promised via the ideology of nature. As is made manifest in the pleasant and insulating landscapes of Exurbia, the pastoral often presents an image of the good life too seamless for easy reading. In building a fortress against the unbearable aspects of modern daily experience, expectations of a different way of life are built directly into the very tableau of yards and houses, yet warding off the confusion and disruption of modernity with wishful pastoral visions of modernity, visions such as those of exurban wilderness and also of the tower insulated in the park, may make it more difficult to understand the details of everyday experiences that are modern, for better or worse. Blurring the here and now with a pastoral compromise of a getaway landscape makes it more difficult to figure out alternatives to the parts of modernity that are so troubling. These pastoral gestures also make it more difficult at the level of daily experience to learn how to inhabit and to renovate and restructure to make more equitably inhabitable both the urban landscapes people might choose to escape and also the exurban landscapes so many people are choosing as a getaway. If we define Exurbia as a pastoral modernity, how does this help pursue the contradictions that Adorno suggests must be worked through to overcome? In identifying and working toward the goals that can be read into the search for a pastoral modernity, can the beauty that Adorno sought to measure be found through a willingness to acknowledge contradictions and not to cover them up? And if pastoral modernity can be understood in terms of an unwillingness to face the mortality of trees, can such an acknowledgement be understood as not only living with death, but also being less inured to the inequality inherent in Exurbia, and instead committing to develop conditions that contribute to keeping open and tractable the contradictions of Exurbia as a version of what Naomi Klein calls exclusive global green zones? Writers such as Thoreau, who have looked to nature to help resolve the contradictions of modernity, have been appropriated as cultural icons of a getaway, a return to nature, but in the light of Heynen's analysis, this can be seen as a classic pastoral simplification. Getaway, especially to nature, is often represented in terms of Thoreau's deliberate living. He went to the woods to live deliberately. However, especially in his most quoted texts, Thoreau explicitly rejected getaway. In addition to his contribution to theories of forest succession, Thoreau's enduring example as a naturalist lies in his steadfast gaze not only at details of the natural environment, but at details of home, not of a getaway nature or, quote, wildness distant from ourselves, end quote, but of the residential and agricultural landscape where he lived, a natural landscape thoroughly inhabited and shaped by humans, for better and for worse, a landscape that landscape photographer Frank Golke describes as worn out, yet inexhaustible. As explained in previous chapters, Thoreau both celebrated and lamented the disruptions of modernity, such as the train, rejecting ever further flung search for wilderness, and standing staunchly behind a philosophy of inhabiting his local environment. In The Machine in the Garden, Leo Marx prefigured Heynen's ideas of pastoral and counter-pastoral with his distinction between a superficial, sentimental pastoral and a more complex, engaged pastoral. Islands of pastoral narrative provide simplifications that perform a function in the face of overwhelming complexity. Sojourn provides insulation from complex details of a situation and may allow access to a creative generativity that might otherwise be overwhelmed. Thoreau's deliberate living at Walden, however, as is argued elsewhere in this collection, transcends the sentimental because of its reflexive deliberation, because the limits and contradictions of his vision of the good life are always kept in view. In chapters 4, 5, and 9, Blum, Donahue, and Looker elaborate Thoreau's engagement with these limits. How do we harness these poetics of a reflexive inhabitation to reform existing home landscapes? Where the wild trees are, real and imagined landscapes. From Simon Schama, Landscape and Memory. Landscapes are culture before they are nature, constructs of the imagination projected onto wood and water and rock. But it should also be acknowledged that once a certain idea of a landscape, a myth, a vision, establishes itself in an actual place, it has a peculiar way of muddling categories, of making metaphors more real than their reference, of becoming, in fact, part of the scenery. The Vanity of Distant Wildness. In his journal entry of August 30th, 1856, almost 9 years after he had left the cabin at Walden Pond, Thoreau wrote, "It is in vain to dream of a wildness distant from ourselves." These words resonate for me, being from New England, where exurbanization has transformed working landscapes in ways that I now see as gentrifying manifestations of the modern pastoral. Like many others who share concern about socio-environmental issues, I return periodically to Thoreau, not only for his palatable metaphors and his insights into the ecology of forest succession, the desire for wildness, and humans' effects on nature, but mostly for his balanced consideration of the necessities of human habitation on the one hand, with a recognition of the desire for a romantic and deep connection to the natural environment on the other. Thoreau's comments on the vanity of distant wildness remind me that the essence of endeavors to inhabit environments is practiced through reflexivity not in an extraordinary way, but in everyday effort and imagination. Fulfilling goals and desires creates the environments of everyday life. Paying attention to how this happens may help us more effectively renegotiate the ways environments are shaped and reproduced. Invoking a useful contrast similar to the contrast positing wishful amenitization of nature against the vanity of distant wilderness, Canadian designer Bruce Mau, in a well-known manifesto about the principles of design and housing, discusses the relationship with nature landscapes in terms of a call for a get to instead of a get away. This call acknowledges tension in the relationship between escape and engagement, and the desire to replace uncomfortable environments with ones that encourage feelings of being at home. Like Thoreau, Mao suggests that being at home requires work whose necessity may be obscured or even effaced by the possibility of instead getting away, even if that getaway is only symbolic. Their comments on the vanity of distant wildness echo much academic work that seeks to convince exurbanites to step back to see the cumulative effects of all exurbanization, not just each exurban getaway, and to put in the effort and imagination to fulfill exurban aspirations in ways that don't reproduce the urban problems Exurbia appears to escape. Thoreau points to a tension manifested strikingly in the everyday landscape of Exurbia, the dream of a getaway one could live in, a comfortable wildness distant from humanity. But as Thoreau continued, there is none such. It is in our brains and bowels, the primitive vigor of nature in us, that inspires that dream. The record of the desire for a natural getaway inscribed in the landscape of Exurbia may provide a means of exploring the dream nature inspires, a dream filled with the tension between get to and get away, and of understanding how the search for nature leads to a paradoxical situation. Seeing humans as alienated from nature, exurbanites seek nature as an escape from the everyday life that appears to alienate them from nature. Yet escape is sought not as a temporary respite, but as a setting for the very everyday life brought to the places where nature is sought, a sticky catch-22. The attempt to inhabit environments creates complex and problematic conflicts between hopeful visions of the environment and the practices of everyday life, and the social and economic systems of which these practices are part. People experience personal conflicts as well, conflict between escaping problems, opting for a getaway, and engaging with them, making a get-to of where we are, or at least making the places we wish to get to places we might engage with, not just anywhere we can get away. This struggle between escaping and engaging is echoed in the interviews I have conducted with exurbanites, although often as a metaphor, a wistful reflection on the immortality of trees and the shame about our need to cut them down. I find in this idea of the immortality of trees an irresistible metaphor of relationship with the exurban environment, an ambiguous and paradoxical relationship that seems to simultaneously place value on the possibility of negotiating more diverse cultural landscapes that combine urban and rural functions, the classic middle landscape, and at the same time overlook or dismiss this possibility, usually by categorically designating landscapes either green or sprawl. In Adulation of Trees and Environment as Nature, I interpret not only reasons that people make environments worse while wishing to make them better, but also potential keys to the rousing of political will for more vigorously negotiated inhabitation. Teasing apart the search for nature may tell us more about what, as a metaphor, it signifies, what it is to which people want to get to, even as they are getting away. This chapter represents my effort to understand what the get to stands for, and what Exurbia says about the goals and desires projected onto it, and in doing so, to understand the conflicts and contradictions in the struggle to negotiate habitation of environments. The illusion of preservation. Trees grow old and die. Well, I guess they do. I never thought of it that way. I guess I figured they hung around forever unless we went at them, but I guess they go around that way. Charles Farquharson, in Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources film, Who's Looking After My Forest, and How's It Going? Then from Mary Burlick and colleagues, The Illusion of Preservation. Deep-seated philosophical objections to harvesting are likely the greatest barrier to changing owners' approach to forest management. As long as the global consequences of consumption are ignored, widespread protectionism is heralded, and logging is abhorred, especially in one's backyard, efforts to reduce wood consumption or to encourage sound management in areas of low ecological impact will be fruitless. Such efforts will only succeed if they are coupled with a fundamental change in attitude that reconciles the ideology of preservation with the reality that using wood means cutting trees somewhere." End quote. Ideological conflicts over nature preservation in the exurban forest demonstrate the problem of the imagined immortality of trees. A recent report arguing for the local production of natural resources in exurban Massachusetts discusses possibilities for and obstacles to sustainable forestry in terms of what its authors call the illusion of preservation. Addressing the forested landscapes that have been the most appealing for exurban residential building and preservation in the last several decades, Harvard forest researchers Mary Burlick, David Kittredge, and David Foster conclude in their study that the most crucial change necessary for a shift to more locally responsible and sustainable forest practices is ideological. Discussing the preservation ethic that has come with the modern embrace of the forest, they explain in the epitaph above that preservation in affluent residential areas is illusory if it is subsidized by exploitation elsewhere. Successful and often laudable environmentalist campaigns championing and using images of grand old forests have perhaps soured images of forestry. Many people object, often with good reason, to either industrial forestry or agriculture in their backyards. But as productive land uses are relegated to the places where they do not bother people who can afford sensitive environmental aesthetics, they become more and more objectionable, removed by distance and politics from the observation of those who could effectively protest. Discussing how the illusion of preservation has become part of the solace that makes nature attractive, Burlick, Kittredge, and Foster call for the exploration of alternatives to current modes of environmental inhabitation. They are concerned that the current zeitgeist of exurban living, particularly, is characterized by obstacles to more reflexive inhabitation, obstacles that present themselves, for example, as the conviction that the larger sources of and solutions to environmental problems lie out there, and that the solutions to pressing environmental problems can be found magically in cultivating fetishes such as immortal-seeming nature. Quote, "Mainstream environmentalist ideology must embrace multiple uses of the forest, including harvesting," they insist, and local citizens must consider the use of resources in their own backyard while maintaining a keen awareness of the global environment. End quote. The difficulty seems to be in the translation between awareness of global environmental problems and representations of a version of nature that fixes environmental problems for us as long as we engage it with environmentally friendly intentions. Commodifying nature. The symbolic image of trees as timelessly powerful, and of nature as in need of human preservation because it will be the source of human preservation, has been tremendously important to movements that rely on a sense of empathy with nature and a desire to champion it. By making nature not only grand, desirable, and untouchable, but also consumable in the abstract through a sense of moral ownership gained from the support of environmental and preservation organizations. Actors that promote protection of wilderness, like the Sierra Club, or organic food, like Whole Foods markets, have gained remarkable success. But this success has also reinforced the commodification and marketing of nature. Political movements to protect the environment through legislation reducing industrial pollution, designating wilderness, and introducing measures of environmental accountability to agriculture have successfully drawn on the awe-inspiring and arresting largeness of photographs in the tradition of Ansel Adams to bring the grandeur of nature to an overwhelmingly urban and suburban public. Especially given their distance from most people's everyday experience, these images have been remarkably successful in marshalling support for everything from conservation funds to organic standards. The powerful appeal of these images of pristine, ancient, uninhabited nature has its downsides, however. Environmentalism writ large may have been helped by capturing and mobilizing the immortality of trees, But this view of nature has also led not only to the illusion of preservation, but also to the commodification of nature. Both this illusion and commodification are used to greenwash the impacts of green sprawl. Advertisements using nature to sell the tools of everyday life, houses and cars particularly, have helped to familiarize the commodification of images of nature, making complex ecologies, political economies, spatial practices, and metaphorical frames superficial and abstract. Presenting nature that can be conquered and consumed through purchase, ads offer a manifestation of a pastoral view of nature as unattainable and awe-inspiring wilderness. If you don't look too closely, if you accept the images in the ads, you can imagine yourself engaging with nature. An exurban car or home promises to allow you to have your roadless and uninhabited forest wilderness and live in it and drive to it too. In this way, like Jefferson Forrest's Sylvan living room, the idealized image of nature denies both the processes and conflicts in environmental interactions, making nature a fetish, a magic promise of effect without effort. The nature fetish promises engagement with nature while hiding the ways in which goods such as SUVs and the infrastructure that support them get in the way of achieving the sustained and substantive interactions with the nature that exurban aspirations appear to imagine. The fetish of nature can replace such interaction, standing in for the negotiations necessary for navigating human roles in the environment. In this commoditized version of nature, environmental harmony can be bought with organic snack food or a Sierra Club subscription, both reliable sources of sacred tree imagery, and the moral credits achieved can be imagined to offset less rewarding environmental habits. This give and take can be part of the way ideology and practice are balanced. It can be part of the reflexive process of dialogue between experience and intention that enables us to revise our ideologies and practices as we try them out in the world. But the danger of symbolizing things like trees or nature to the point where they become merely fetishes is that they obscure the necessity of the negotiated and social process of this dialogue. In the gap between material environments and imagined ones, such fetishes create illusory problem closure, a smooth, grassy lawn and a specimen forest, where exurbanites might see instead the layers of care, conflict, and past experience written in the landscapes which surround us. These layers embody the socio-environmental context that need to be more explicitly negotiated in managing environments. Karl Marx discussed the problem of commodity fetishism in the opening chapter of Capital. Using as an example the idea of magical power attributed to objects as fetishism in the, quote, mist-enveloped regions of the religious world, end quote, Marx explored the way in which fetishization of commodities blinds people to the social and creative processes that gave value to these commodities. Instead, fetishes confer a naturalized power, an ability, if the fetishes in question can be acquired, to bestow what is desired without work or action. In addition, like Thoreau, Marx understood that by placing humans outside of nature, the ideology of nature alienates humans from their place within nature. Such an ideology not only obscures the processes that give value to commodities, which are ultimately made out of social and ecological relations, materials, and labor, but also makes it more difficult for people to see these processes as the ways in which humans consistently do engage with nature. Instead of seeing transformation of natural materials into the stuff of everyday life as a central way in which humans inhabit nature, we often see these mediating processes as alienating aspects of modernity. This alienated view disengages people from the very ways they engage and govern environments, and feeds into the vicious circle of landscape commodification and the degradation of disinvestment and gentrification cycles involved in escaping to getaway places.